Masayu. Welcome to The Cosmos, the podcast for curious souls, open minds, traveler hearts, and the wild range of culture. My name is Kim, I'm your host, and I'm very excited to go into this episode today. Hey you, hey you. Meet my interview partner today. His name is Robert Vetter. He's a resident of Long Island, New York, and he's an anthropologist and educational consultant specializing in Native American studies. He also received his master's in anthropology from the University of Oklahoma, where he first started very young with field studies and then really opening up a universe and being adapted into a Native American family. He's going to talk about how all of this process took place and how much it also still today means to him and how much it was grounded in what he does today on this experience. Robert created also journeys into American Indian territory to immerse non-Indians in the often secret world of Native Americans and their cultures through specialized educational tours throughout Indian country. Robert's programs have been featured in the New York Times, the Washington Post, the NBC's Today Show, and the Travel Channel's Lonely Planet Treks. I am excited to go into this interview with you. We are going to also talk about his book in the end, which is The Big Bow, where he actually talked with his, let's say, teacher, guide, also leader, spiritual leader, Richie. And through this conversation they had, on base of that, he wrote the book. But it had been quite an interesting process, especially because he wasn't able to write everything. And he talks a lot about different aspects which we also nowadays can integrate into our daily life. And some of them I'm actually really sure there's a deep longing within many humans I know, but also humans probably that will be reached through this podcast who feel this longing as well. This longing of remembering, this longing of knowing that there's more, and this longing that we are part of a much bigger picture, especially in this time and space where it's so much about individualization, but in the end, we all have this longing of being part of something. And I really have been honored to talk to Bob, and I hope you also can feel so nurtured by this interview as I have been as a host. So thank you so much. Bob, how are you doing?
I'm very well, Kim. Thank you so much for having me today.
Thank you for being here. I would like to go because I know if someone is maybe just listening, you cannot see this beautiful pattern behind you. But I'm going to put up a picture for you guys so you can see the pattern. Would love to know, is there a special meaning about the pattern you have in behind you?
Well, there's a special meaning to the type of blanket that it is. It's a Pendleton blanket. And Pendletons, well, just a quick history. Among the Plains Indian people or Native Americans of the Plains in the 1800s, while the buffalo was still widely available, a traditional gift that one person might give to another was a buffalo robe. And there was a symbolic act of wrapping somebody in a buffalo robe that might be painted or it might be unpainted. But when somebody was adopting another person, or even when a couple was getting married, they would wrap the person in that buffalo robe. Now, when the buffalo were hunted almost to extinction by the federal government's directive, there were no longer buffalo robes available. So a company in Pendleton, Oregon, started making these traditional blankets out of wool using traditional Native American designs. And from then up until today, the Pendleton blanket has become a traditional gift. that's given during adoptions. And in my case, a number of times when I was adopted into a native family or community, I was wrapped in one of these Pendleton blankets. So today they have a very strong symbolic meaning, not as much the specific design of it as the Pendleton itself, as the meaning behind it in extending these kin relations. And at ceremonies, they're often given away by a
Mhm.
family to people who are there in attendance.
Could you say it's like, for example, the fajas, the belts in the Guatemalan or in also I know in the South American cultures you have that as well, that are protective as well? Or is it really more like
No,
something of an adoption of like you are included now, you're part of the family?
yeah, you're included. You are a member of the family. I mean, what's symbolically happening when you think about it, here we are living in a vulnerable world, right?
Mm,
Where it's cold in a sense in our wider world. So what does the blanket do? You wrap somebody in it to
mm.
show them the kindness and the concern that you have for them.
I would like, before we go a little bit into your history, I want to talk about kindness with you. You said something about kindness, and I don't want to make a comparison, but for you, having lived with elders, being adopted in different families, as you have mentioned, in different Native American families, how did your perception of kindness change?
Well, okay, perhaps I'll start with the story.
Yes, start the story. I'm ready. Are you ready, guys?
So, so I, what happened was just to give you a little bit of a backstory about how I showed up in the first place. Um, so in 1980, I moved from New York to Oklahoma, where I began my graduate studies at the University of Oklahoma. At the time, I had absolutely no interest in Native Americans. I mean, my area of interest at the time was in Asian cultures, and I had been to India. I had learned, from the time that I was in middle school or junior high school, I was studying Hinduism, Buddhism, Taoism, lots of Eastern practices, yoga, meditation. So I really had no interest in Native Americans, but I showed up and I had a dual major in philosophy and anthropology. And at first, I was there studying philosophy. I was in the graduate, I was in the Department of Philosophy, uh, and I had an assistantship. Now, I
Mhm,
just didn't like the courses that I was taking, didn't really click with the people that I had met there, and I was ready to turn around and go back to New York. At the last minute,
mhm,
I went into the anthropology department and I, just told them who I was. And it turned out that they offered me the same assistantship that I had with the same package of financial aid if I would teach introduction to anthropology. So I agreed to do that. The only problem was that it was too late in the semester for me to enroll in any classes that were ongoing, but I had to have a full-time course load in order to be in the department. So the compromise was that I would do an ethnographic study. And since my whole area of interest was the intersection of healing and spirituality, I figured that the field work that I would do would concern Native Americans because there are more different tribes living in the state of Oklahoma than anywhere else in the United States.
mhm,
So I decided that I would do a study, try to meet a medicine man from a particular any tribe.
mhm,
I didn't know one tribe from another.
mhm,
So I met with my advisor, and my advisor said, "Okay, well, you can begin your field work." And I said, "Well, how do I start?" And he said, "Well, I don't know. You're just going to go out and use a networking approach, and you can meet one person who will introduce you to another, to another, to
mhm,
another, and maybe eventually you'll meet a medicine man." Now, I was very disappointed because my thought was this guy had spent his entire life doing field work. Why can't you just tell me somebody to go to and let me get started?
Mhm.
And I think that he wanted to make my life difficult. So I went and I told this a roommate that I had this roommate who I was sharing an apartment with. I didn't know the guy at all, but I had met him from the housing board, and he and I were sharing an apartment together. And I just went back and I told him how bummed out I was about the fact that, I was going to start my field work. I thought this guy was going to help me, blah, blah, blah. And this guy, Jim, he said to me, "Oh, well, maybe I can help you." And I said, "Well, I don't know how you're going to help me." And it turned out that Jim was a quarter Comanche. And he said, "The
Mhm.
next time that my family has a gathering, you can come as my guest." So a couple of weeks later, his family had a gathering in a typical, honestly, typical Native American event, which was we get there and the women were putting the meal together. The men, mostly older men, were sitting in a circle of folding chairs under a shade tree. The women were all over by the tables putting the meal together.
Mhm.
So Jim and I walked up, and Jim introduced me. And I was used to being very, very direct. Perhaps that's as a New Yorker. And as I was introduced, I said, "Hi, hello, everybody. My name is Bob Vetter. I'm a graduate student in anthropology, and I'm hoping to meet a medicine man." Well, what I didn't realize was that I had just committed like the worst faux pas
The
imaginable.
crime.
And it was absolute silence. Everybody in that circle stared at me without saying a word. And, the silence was deafening and awkward. So finally, one of the women came over and she said, "Oh, the meal is ready." And I was like, "Oh, thank God." So I go and I sit next to Jim, and, we're just sitting there eating quietly. After the meal was over, an old man came up to me kind of when nobody was really looking. And he sort of whispered to me and he said, I heard what you said about wanting to meet a medicine man. He said, "From what I know, we still have one medicine man left in our tribe, but I don't know his name. I don't know where he lives. I don't really know anything about him, but I know another old man who I think might be able to help you. And his name is Woodgie Watchataker. He doesn't have a phone, but I'll draw you a map to find his house."
Wonderful.
So he draws me a map on a napkin and he hands it to me. And I said to Jim, I said, "Oh, well, I guess I'll go pretty soon because I got to get started on this." And Jim said, "Well, if you want, I'll go with you." So the next week came, we got in my car and we started driving and trying to find this guy's house. And it normally would be about an hour and a half ride to get there, but it took hours because we were totally lost. There were no landmarks, there was no GPS at the time. And, we were just lost trying to find this guy's house. So finally, we find this guy's house and we walk up to the front door. And I remember on my way to the front door, I remember thinking to myself, well, I'm really glad that Jim is here because he's Comanche and he's going to know what to say. So we get up to the front door, knock on the door, and this old, old man comes to the door with long gray hair and braids. And he's standing at the doorway and he looks at me and Jim. And I'm looking over at Jim because I thought Jim was going to say something. And Jim was looking at me thinking that I was going to say something. And finally I was like, well, somebody's going to have to say something. So I said, "Hi, my name is Bob Vetter. I'm an anthropology student at the University of Oklahoma. And I was hoping that you would talk to us about the Comanches." And again, he just stared at me without saying a word. And finally, when he spoke, he said to me, "This is how you come to my house?" And I didn't know what he was getting at. So I said, "Yeah." And he said, "This is the way that you come to my house to see me?" And I said, "Yeah." And he opened the door and he said, "Come in here for a minute." And he invited us in, but it wasn't really a friendly invitation
Mhm.
in any way. He pointed to the couch that was next to that front door. And he said to me and Jim, "Sit down over there." Jim and I sat down.
Mhm.
I felt like I was
Mhm.
a child being scolded. So he said, "Sit down over there." And he stormed out of the room and he went into a back room and he came back a minute later and he had this painting in his hand, a beautiful painting that he had done. of a Comanche war dancer. I said, wow, that's really beautiful. But he wasn't really interested in my thoughts about his artwork, but he held it up and he said, see this? And I said, yeah. And he said, I'm an artist and I have better things to do than to sit around talking to you. And another thing, he said, this is no way to visit an Indian. And I said, well, what do you mean? And he said, well, if you're going to visit an Indian, the least thing you could do is bring him something to eat. Now, I didn't know what to say. I didn't know what to do. I just said, I'm really sorry. Jim and I got off the couch, walked back to the car, and drove all the way back to Norman, the town that we lived in another part of Oklahoma. So we were both kind of rattled by what had just happened and, didn't really say very much on the way back, but I mentioned something about going back to this guy's house. And Jim was really angry about it. He said, you're going back to that guy's house? And I said, yeah. And he said, I wouldn't go back to that guy's house if you paid me.
Wow.
The next week came and I went by myself. By the way, I am going to answer your question.
Yeah, no, I know, but you brought something to eat.
Well, so this time, yeah. Now, let me say, my financial aid had not come in yet, and I was beyond poor. I mean, I had to scrape together enough money to buy the gas to drive there, and I had a few dollars left that I bought some groceries in a paper bag. I mean, it was not much. It was everything that I could do to come up with enough money to buy that. So I got up to the door this time, knocked on the door. The same old man came to the door. And this time he looked at me, he looked at the paper bag, which I handed to him, and he got a big smile on his face and he held out his hand. He shook my hand and he said, now that's the way you visit an Indian. And that was the moment that this part of my journey really began. Because eventually, Woodgie became my advisor. He became the one who introduced me to a completely different way of life, a completely different way of understanding my being in the world. Woodgie and his wife were the first ones that I did my field work with. Now, his wife, Eva, was the niece of a woman named Sanapia. And in fact, there's an excellent book on Comanche medicine called Sanapia, Comanche Medicine Woman, which was an ethnography about a Comanche medicine woman who was Eva's aunt. So the two of them began talking to me about Comanche spirituality, healing practices, and eventually Woodgie became my uncle. So he was the first one that I developed these kin relations with. And he showed me tremendous kindness. So you asked me about kindness. And really, I think that the first lesson in Native spirituality, in my way of learning it, was kindness and respect. And I had the idea in my mind to be respectful and to be kind, but I didn't necessarily know the way that it should be expressed in that cultural context. So when you asked me about the blanket behind me and I tried to talk about the meaning of it, it all has to do with this story and the whole story that unfolded from there about how Woodgie introduced me to Oliver Patapony, who became my grandfather and really the central person in this whole story.
Before we go to Oliver, where I really want to dive in also a little bit more, I would also clarify because I don't know if all the listeners really know what kin relationships are. No, traditionally it's ties like based on blood and marriage, but what I understood is like that they are including you, even though it's basically a water relationship, or is there also a ceremony behind it? Of course, you mentioned the blanket, you mentioned that is not just like here the blanket, like the same thing as you come on the doorstep and you bring something. There's like a lot around this as well. But could you go a little bit deeper into that?
Sure. So Anthropologists refer to the practice that I'm describing here
Mhm.
as fictive kinship.
Mhm.
So fictive meaning in the sense that we are not related by blood, not that it is something false.
Mhm.
So fictive kinship is extending kin relations to a person that you're not related to, and it can either be formal or informal. In the case of my Comanche grandpa, that I eventually found, I didn't even know that he considered me a grandson at first until his daughter was in the hospital. I went to visit her in the hospital, and she explained the whole thing to me, that he now considered me a grandson,
Okay.
and
Wow.
eventually gave me a name. Now,
Mhm.
in the case of my many, many, many years later, my Cheyenne father, whose name was Moses Starr, he took me as a son. And in his case, it was a much more formalized ceremony. We went outside, and he brought with him an eagle feather, and he was a camp crier at
What
the
is a camp
annual.
crier?
So the camp crier is the one who announces in the Cheyenne language what's going on during various ceremonies, including the annual Sundance.
Mhm.
So they called it hollering. He would yell out to the spirit that accompanies each of the four intercardinal directions, and be a kind of a mediator between those spirits and the people gathered in ceremony. So we went outside, and he spoke to each of the directions and explained to these spirits what he was doing in adopting me and taking me as his son.
Wow.
So that's why I say it can either
Yeah.
be
Yeah.
formal or informal.
Um, so yeah, let's for a moment before we continue with the story, I want to go into something. Um, if you look at yourself as Bob at that stage, at the doorstep, and the Bob who you are now, and I know this is probably like a whole universe, that question, but maybe there's a if you name three or maximum five things, how this has been changing maybe your whole like view on the world, the way how you behave with others, what would be like the five things which additionally you would also share with others in the sense of like, hey, if you include them, your life has so much more also purpose or like the spiritual connection.
5 things is a lot.
I know you
I
could
give
go
you,
with three. I
but
thought you have much more. I thought
I
you would be,
do. I
oh,
have
I
a
got a
lot, but
50.
it all comes
Yes.
out in the stories. So okay, so the first one is kind of where we are right now, which
Okay.
is this notion of family.
Mhm,
We live in a world that is very disintegrated,
mhm,
where a lot of the forces that are in play in the wider society divide us, and it's only accelerated as a result of COVID, where we were living in isolation from one another for a year and a half. I mean, I don't know what it's like where you live, but I spent basically a year plus in my home. So the things that connect us as human beings have become more and more divisive as a result of social media, COVID, all of the things that are going on are divide us. So this notion of community is maybe the most important thing, to develop community in order to heal through this process. Family relation is a way to do it, this extended family. So um in my case, I have this extended family among a number of tribes in Oklahoma that I return to year after year after year.
mhm,
But if you don't have that, I guess the thing that I would say is, how can you deepen the nature of your relationships where you are?
mhm,
Face-to-face relations.
mhm,
What can I give to others? How can we share something that is deeper than surface level conversation? So, very often for me, It's through gathering and ceremony. So that's, I would say that that has meaning and that has purpose. So family, community.
May I interrupt you
Sure.
on that? There's a song in German which is super beautiful, and he says, erzähl was von dir, was mich wirklich berührt und den, der dir zuhört, nicht die Seele zuschnürt. And it's basically saying, tell me something that deeply touches you and not that basically is tangling my soul. And it's and he's saying like, yeah, go and take your heart to your mind and let them work together. But it's such a beautiful line. And as you said, like when we share, to have these, yeah, these spaces. And so thank you so much. And for everyone who is listening to that, to also, yeah, to maybe find this space even in your own family. I mean, I'm back home right now because I broke my foot, and it's quite interesting because I have a very challenging relationship to my mom. And we actually now are in a context with a third person, and she's helping us so beautifully. And I did understand that I didn't understand my mother. And it's now, there's a so much more beautiful connection because we actually start listening to each other. And even in that level, I mean, if you can't sit in community and to start with that. Yeah. So thank you so much.
I love that phrase, your translation of it. I wish I spoke
Yeah, it was
German to
bad. It was
understand the deeper meaning of it. But this
bad.
connection of heart and mind is in itself a teaching. You know, you asked me about the lessons,
Mhm.
connecting heart and mind, because,
Mhm.
you know, in the example that I gave you of my life, here I am starting out as an academic discipline. So that's the mind, but it was through my work with Indigenous people that I came to understand the importance and feel the importance of relating to the world through heart. And ultimately, you know, what could be better than to connect mind and heart together?
Mhm.
So you put it very succinctly, this connection of mind and heart.
Mm.
Another
It's
lesson.
yeah, another
Did you
lesson.
did you want to delve into that one more, or should I go on to my third?
No, let's go to the third.
Okay, so
Maybe we come back to
the
that.
third is to find meaning in personal crisis.
Ui, ui, ui. Mhm.
And you know, so much of our lives lies in this understanding, you know, suffering. Why, and you and I communicated a little bit about this before we even got on the podcast.
Mhm.
Why do we suffer as human beings? You know, what do we, why isn't life easy? Why don't we grow easily? You know,
Why? Why is that? If you have a great, why is that? I think everyone on this podcast would be like, yeah, why? Why, Bob? I mean, come on. I would
well,
give
that's not even
me
what
the
I was going to
pill.
answer. I was going to say that through our suffering that we find meaning.
Yeah, true.
You know, and I'm not a Buddhist, so I, you know, I've got no skin in the game, so to speak. But I will say something about the story of Buddha's life. Siddhartha Gautama, according to the story, he was born into a royal family, and his parents were told that he would, by a soothsayer, by a fortune teller or oracle, that this was one special child, and he could go in one of two directions. He could either become this magnificent king, or he would be a redeemer of human souls. And his father wanted to make sure that he would inherit the throne and he would be this great leader. So he protected him from all of the suffering in the world. They kept him within the confines of the royal palace. But he goes out, he sort of escapes one day as a young man. He's never seen human suffering, and what does he see? He sees death on the streets. He sees aging, and what was the third? I don't know, there was a third.
Sick, I think. Sick, death, and aging, or
Sickness, right.
yeah,
Sickness.
yeah.
Yeah. So all of a sudden he's exposed to human suffering.
Mm.
And he goes down that completely different path. And he discovers this way of putting an end to suffering. But the point is that he said it is with it the essence of human life contains suffering within it.
Mm.
Now, why? In my opinion, we attach meaning in order to deal with suffering.
Mhm.
And if you think about it, you know,
Mm.
usually people do not come to great spiritual understanding without a level of suffering. Now, there are people who experience much deeper suffering than others, but when everything, one Cheyenne elder, this man, Willie Fletcher, what he said to me was, he said, when you think about it, when do we really go to the Creator? When do we really try to communicate with the Creator? As human beings, it tends to be when we encounter suffering in our lives.
Mm.
So the way that I look at it, I do a lot of one-on-one healing work. And in the course of doing that, I often encounter tremendous suffering.
Mm.
People who have dealt with absolutely unspeakable trauma.
Yeah.
And when you ask me, why would that happen? I'm not so quick to go to karma. I'm not so quick to do anything other than to say the suffering is what it is.
Mm.
However, as human beings, we can attach meaning to that suffering.
Mm.
That's a very intentional process that a person goes through. They reflect on their suffering and somehow use it to connect with others. And I think of this formula. You've probably heard of something called the medicine wheel, and that is a
Mhm.
circle with an equilateral cross through the center of it. And it's an explanatory mechanism that you could use to understand anything.
Mhm.
And I've employed it a number of times to explain what happens as a result of crisis. What do we do with crisis? So what we do, what we do is we understand crisis in a number of ways. We come to it with prayer. We come to it with sacrifice. Through this prayer and sacrifice, if everything is right about us, we experience some sort of a transformation. And then the fourth part of that is to bring something back to the community. We talked about community at the very beginning. So crisis is an opportunity for a
And that's
transformation, both of an individual as well as the wider community. So to me, that is the formula for what to do about human suffering. I don't have an explanation for you as to why we suffer, other than to say it is an opportunity for each one of us to create and generate meaning out of it. So I guess you could say that I have an existential outlook on suffering, that it simply is what it is. It's part of our thrownness into the world.
it's yeah, thank you so much. I totally agree. Also because I just had an experience especially like that, that it was all coming into place, and I'm here healing the relationship to the feminine, to my mother, and through this broken leg and not being able to go back to Berlin, and having it broken also in Guatemala, which taught me a lot about offering, about community, accepting help, receiving. And it was really hard for me to accept all these lessons, but I totally agree. And I really had to really badly break this foot in order to get to the stage. So,
So one of the teachings that goes along with this has to do
Mm,
with, I mean, your example is perfect because
mm,
you were broken in some way.
mhm,
And we could look at it metaphorically and literally in your life. It
mhm,
was a result of your brokenness that you returned home to rethink this relationship with your mother. And
mhm,
what happens when a bone breaks is
mm.
that it becomes stronger than it was, than the surrounding bone. The place where the bone broke is stronger than the surrounding bone.
Wow, yeah,
And that's what
true.
happens. This is your opportunity right now in your life to be stronger as a result of that break, both physically and metaphorically and spiritually.
Absolutely. Yeah. I hope for everyone who's listening, maybe it's exactly at that stage. And when you are facing right now, maybe it is a broken bow, maybe it's a loss, and there's so many different things to, yeah, to have either someone who is also guiding you on that journey, but also to be able to change the perspective. Because I'm so with you, Bob, that all the sufferings, there's this part where we turn towards spirit. And I was really, there was also a part, I realized something else the other day. Sometimes it's hard to show up for oneself, and even especially in our societies, for the community, with all, let's say, the difficulties within family constellations. But what I found was the place to turn up for spirit. There's this part of me, it was like, it's interesting, through that I can start to turn up for me and for others. And it was really this, it was really, really beautiful, because I got a lot of different points of view in that journey. I was like, yeah, wow, what are we turning? This is always this question in the coaching and trainer scene, like, wow, so why are you waking up? Why? Maybe it's much more sincere. It's much more, let's say, uh like, thin-aired, this answer, than it you can say like, oh, it has to be that thing. No, there's something much more subtle.
And if you think about it, it
Mm,
is an opportunity, but it's not something that has to occur in a particular way. So here's what I
mm,
mean by that.
mhm,
When you go into a crisis,
mm,
you have a choice. One choice is to learn and grow.
mhm,
The other choice is to be broken by it, become a victim, and remain in that victim mentality, in
mhm,
which case you have not answered the call to grow and to heal as a result of the circumstances of your life. And I think, you, everybody knows somebody who had that call, they had that crisis, but what did they
absolutely.
do? They became embittered rather than growing through it. And I love to give the example of, I don't know if you have it in Germany. Do you have a game in Germany called Shoots and Ladders, a child's game?
What is it?
It's a
Shoots and ladders? Like,
shoot.
what do you do?
So it's
Maybe
a,
I have it. Like, I just know. I don't know.
yeah,
Have the literal translation.
in the United States, we have a game called Shoots and Ladders. A
Mhm.
shoot is like a slide that that you slide
Mhm.
down
Mhm.
like a,
Mhm.
a
Yeah,
in a playground.
eine
And
Rutsche.
that's what it's called.
Ja, Rutsche.
Okay. So the game, you roll a die and you move your piece, and at certain places on the board, you drop down, and then
Aha.
you're behind the other players. And then in other cases, you'll land on a ladder, and the ladder jumps you up to a higher place on the board. And
Mhm.
it's a children's game. But I had the idea to use shoots and ladders to describe this process that we go through in life. And that's why I developed this game that I called Sustos. Now,
Mhm.
Susto is literally spiritual fright, and it's a condition that is considered a universal human problem in Latin America. But in curanderismo, which you probably know is something that I teach, something that I practice, we use soul retrieval to deal with susto. this soul loss. So I had the idea to take this concept and to
Mm.
develop it through a game. So I
Mhm.
researched Chutes and Ladders, the children's game, and I found out it didn't start as a children's game. It started out as a game for Hindu monks to play to understand the stages that we go through in seeking enlightenment, that there are
Mm.
opportunities that we have that bump us up spiritually, and
Mhm.
there are other experiences that we have that may drop us down spiritually. And I said, you know what? That's exactly the metaphor for understanding susto.
Mhm.
When an event happens in our life that is a crisis, that is a turning point, a piece, a splinter of the soul gets left in the place and the time that it occurred. And it's a good short-term strategy that we use to be able to compartmentalize trauma and difficult events. Temporarily, it helps us, but it leaves part of our intrinsic life force in that spot. And
Mhm.
often sustos stack on top of sustos.
Mhm.
And all of a sudden, with each one, I lose a little bit more of my vitality, a little bit more, a little bit more, a little bit more, until I'm not my complete self.
Mhm.
So a susto is exactly what we're describing here. It's an opportunity for spiritual growth, or it can be what drops us down to a lower level and allows us to stick with a victim mentality that keeps us from that type of growth. So that game, Sustos, that I created,
Yeah.
available on my website as a download. You can play it with your friends, and all you need is a die. You roll the die
Yeah.
and move a corresponding number of spaces, and it'll ask you to talk about with your friends that you're playing it with about moments in your life that you had sustos.
It's interesting. Before we go, like, of course, for everyone who's listening, I will put the website below. I will also put the link to the book of Bob. So just that you know that you're not, oh God, oh God, oh God, where do I find it? Um, but what I was thinking, I heard about actually a game, was a card game, and it was exactly in that direction, and they took it at some point off the market, and it was actually an American card game, but I don't just remember. It's just like how interesting. It's exactly that, like, to ask these questions. And I think also in this process, and I want to come back to what the original question was, what I also found with my encounters with indigenous communities, the form of listening.
Mhm.
It's so beautiful.
Sacred listening.
Yeah. Wow. Coming back to that, is there any other, like you said, notion of family? You said also giving back. I found this really interesting. You didn't say taking. It's also interesting when we talk about all Western societies of like, oh, I don't get enough.
Mhm.
Maybe you have a take on that as well, like more this feeling of like, I don't have enough, I don't get enough. And I also encountered that. It's like, no, we actually don't give enough from that, like, sincere place, connecting heart and mind. And then actually meaning in personal crisis. Through suffering we find meaning. That was the points I wrote down to my question. Is there anything um, you would like also to add when you think about the Bob from that doorstep to now, that he also,
Oh my goodness. Well, yes.
yeah, so
Yes.
true.
Yeah, I
Yes,
mean, so
go on,
one of
go,
the
yeah,
things
yeah.
was my notion that and this is in the bio that you
Mhm.
read, which
Mhm.
led to your questions to me. I've had a spiritual yearning and hunger from the time that I was a child. And I always
Mm.
felt like the answers that were given didn't fulfill me, didn't
Mm.
really grasp the nature of how I felt on the deepest level. And so I sought spiritual technologies, and I went to, as I told you, Hinduism, Buddhism, Taoism, all of these different practices. And at the time, I had the notion that my spirituality was an individual quest.
Mhm.
I had there was this I don't know, there's a Chinese reference. I don't even remember what it was, but in some Chinese text, I think there was a book written by the title Cloud Hidden, Whereabouts Unknown.
Mhm.
And it's within Taoism. And I had this fantasy that as an old guy, if anybody ever asked what happened to Bob, the answer would be he's cloud hidden, whereabouts unknown. And I could be like one of these ancient Chinese sages that's just like, up in the mountains somewhere, totally isolated. And so I had this idea that my spiritual growth is for me and me alone,
Mhm.
that I
Mhm.
find it in isolation. And if I had
Mhm.
to answer what is most significantly different about me now, it is to say that I see growth, at least for me. I'm not making any
Mhm.
judgment for anybody else, but that it is within the context of the collective, whether the collective is a small family group, a wider community, a tribe, the entire human race, that my growth is somehow connected with others and it doesn't exist in isolation. And have found that through my work in indigenous communities, and it was very different than the way that I started out.
What I found interesting in that part, and that's something you just brought me to, the way how in, for example, Asian ancient cultures and also Native and also Southern Middle American indigenous communities, spirituality is lived.
Mm-hmm.
As it probably something you also have been like pondering about, living it, experiencing it, maybe also researching about, because it's, don't you feel, would you say in the core, it is the same? Or is it what you just mentioned, that there's a lot of spiritual growth when we look, for example, into Buddhism? There's the monk that goes to the mountains and he's pondering or he's finding his answers, but still going maybe afterwards back into the town, sharing, and then going back into the mountains. While in the Native American societies or tribes, it is this coming together in family and communion. Or how would you see it?
Can I illustrate it with the story of Oliver Patapony?
Please, let's go to Oliver. I love it. Thank
I,
you.
I think that story
Yes,
is
yes,
going to
let's
tie
go.
up all
Yes,
of our
yes,
loose ends.
yes. Okay, let's go. Let's go.
So, getting back to the story that I told you before, which was with Woodgie, this old man who eventually became
Mhm,
my uncle, he
mhm.
became my link to Oliver Patapony. So,
That was the medicine man, right? You
right,
were
Oliver
searching for
Patapony
your peers.
is the medicine man
Yeah,
who eventually
yeah.
adopted me as a grandson. And
Mhm,
uh, there's a whole big story about how I finally met him, but let's just fast forward to I meet him.
mhm,
I have a very brief encounter with him and I tell him what it is that I want to do. And he tells me to come back. So I go back to my advisor and I tell my advisor what happened. And my advisor in the department said, "Oh, that's great. So now that you know him, eventually maybe he can tell you something about medicine." And I said, "What do you mean? How long do I have to wait to learn about medicine?" And he said, "I don't know, till he trusts you, maybe 6 months or a year." So I went back. So I said, "Well, what am I going to talk about?" He said, "Well, maybe you could ask him some questions about traditional stories." So I show up the next time and I have a legal pad in front of me with a list of questions that have to do with traditional Comanche stories that I have researched in the meantime. So I sit down with him and he said, "What do you want to talk about?" And I said, "Well, I was thinking maybe we could start with some traditional Comanche stories." And he thought about it for a moment. He said, "Well, my wife's sister talks to somebody from the university about things like that." He said, "But to tell you the truth, I think that that's just a bunch of fairy stories." he said, though, if you want to
Yeah.
hear stories
Yeah.
that are true stories, and I can tell you what I've been through in my own life, I can tell you what I know from my own experience.
Mm.
And he told me the story that I'm about to tell you about his life. So he said, I didn't start out to want to be a doctor. He referred to himself as a doctor. He was a medicine man. I didn't start out wanting to be a doctor, but I got sick. And I went into the hospital, and it turned out that I had cancer. And the doctors kept me in the hospital for a while until finally the head doctor came in one day and he said, the doctors here had a series of meetings about your case, and we know that you have cancer and it's terminal. And we've done everything for you that we can in terms of the diagnostics and in terms of the treatment. And you can stay here if you want, and we can do everything that we can to ease your pain, or you can go home. It's up to you, but we've done everything for you that we can. And his wife and his son came in and he explained to them, he said, well, the doctors gave up on me. He said, so
Mm.
he said to his son, I want you to take me out there to the hills and leave me there. Maybe I can try to take care of this the way that our old folks used to. Now, what he was talking about is what non-native people often refer to as a vision quest. Now, none of the Indian people I know ever use that term, but anthropologists use it, non-Indians use it to describe this ceremony where a person goes out and they fast for a certain amount of time in a place usually that is a known place of power. So no food, no water, no companionship, none of the comforts that we normally have, no shelter. You're just out there in an encounter with nature. And, sometimes something amazing happens, sometimes it
Mm.
doesn't.
Yeah. Mm.
So he explained to his wife and his son, he says to the son, I want you to take me out there to the hills and leave me out there the way that our old folks used to. And his wife, my grandma Esther, she said to him, you're not man enough to take it. They're going to run you off. Now, I have to explain that phrase. Their belief, the Comanche belief, is that at these places of known power, that there are spirits that inhabit those places,
Mm.
and they may have a gift that they can give you, but before they do, they're going to test you. They're going to test your resolve. They're not going to make it easy for you in any way. And when she said you're not man enough to take it, they're going to run you off, she meant that the spirits are going to scare you, and
Mm.
you're not tough enough to take whatever's going to happen out there. And their belief is that if you go to one of these places and you don't fulfill what you set out to do, you decide beforehand how long you're going to be there and that you'll endure whatever it takes. If you leave there for any reason, whatever it was that you intended to go there for, you're never going to get it, no matter what.
Mm.
So she was discouraging him from going. And he said, well, I've got nothing to lose. The
Absolutely. Yeah.
doctors gave up on me anyway. So he said his son took him to this place, a high rise in a lower ground that was facing toward a mountain called Mount Scott in the Wichita Mountains in southwest Oklahoma. And he said, I all I had with me was a sheet to cover myself, an eagle feather, tobacco, and 4 corn shucks. The corn shucks are the husk on the corn that you normally peel off,
Mm.
but Comanches roll tobacco in the corn shucks to make these prayer smokes.
Mm.
Kind of you're probably familiar with the use of the sacred pipe. This is kind of the equivalent, but
Mm.
he had 4 corn shucks. So he said, my son left me at that spot, So
Did
I
they
had
make a time? Like, did they put, for example, I don't know, 2 weeks or something? Or
no, no, no. Well, no, in his case, it was he had committed to be there until the next day. So he
okay.
was going to spend all that day, that night, and into the next day. And that was when the son would come and check up on him.
Mhm.
So he said that and he had a sheet to cover himself up. So it was the eagle feather, the corn shucks, the tobacco, and the sheet to cover up.
Mhm.
So he said that, over the course of the day and into the night, he smoked the 4 corn shuck cigarettes, and he said nothing happened. So I asked him, well, did you sleep? And he said, no, I was way too scared to sleep.
Mhm.
But towards morning, now he went on the night of a new moon, and that was part of this formula for that specific version of the vision quest that he went on and he eventually sent me on, was the night of a new moon, so that there's no light
Mhm.
outside at all. And he said toward morning, he said I could hear the rumbling of the leaves over toward Mount Scott. And when I looked over, I saw a fire that would light up and then it would go out. And then it would light up and then it would go out. And I just sat there frozen looking at this. And I could see that flame moving towards me. And then I started to be able to make out an outline of what looked like a human form. And I realized that the flame was every time, he called this the visitor, every time the visitor exhaled, it shot fire out of its mouth. And he said, I saw it coming closer and closer and closer to me. And he said, I got more and more scared and I started trembling as I saw this visitor coming towards me until the visitor was right in front of me.
Mhm.
And he said, then the visitor shot me with that fire. And he said, that was it. Everything stopped. My heart stopped. My breathing stopped. He said, I was a pathetic man. He said, I was like, if you take a fish and you pull it out on dry land and the fish is just helpless. He said, I was that way. But now I couldn't move. I couldn't speak until finally, he said, the visitor began to speak to me in my Comanche language. And when I heard the words of the visitor, everything came back. And all of a sudden, I could move again and I could breathe again. And the visitor asked me, he said, what are you doing here? And my grandpa chief said, I'm sick. And the visitor said, there's nothing the matter with you. He said, you're going to be all right. But they sent me to take care of somebody who's real bad off. And with that, the visitor had done everything he needed to do. So he was ready to leave. And he started to take off in the direction of the west, which is the direction of the setting sun. It's also
Mhm.
symbolically the direction sometimes we say of death, which is
Mhm.
out on that horizon. And he said the visitor turned back to me for a moment and he said to me, he said, son, did you know that this whole world that we live in stops for a very little while, for just a moment at this time, right before the sun comes up? And he said, that's the time when things like me can enter into this world. And then the visitor turned back to the west and the visitor departed. And he said, that was the last time that I ever saw the visitor. But a while later, my son showed up, and my son
Mhm.
saw me out there on that field, and he ran up to me and he said, Dad, he said, are you all right? How did you make it through the night last night? It was so cold and you were out here with nothing. And Grandpa Chief said, where I was at, it was like springtime. And in that spot where he was, it had stayed warm. But when they got down from that little rise on that field, everywhere else there was a hard frost on the ground, except for where he had been.
Mhm.
Now, he didn't quite know yet what to make out of that experience. The one thing that he did know was that he was well. So he never went back to the doctors again. And he lived for a long, long time after that, apparently cured of this incurable cancer.
Mhm.
But that's not where the story ends. He was walking, he lived outside of a little town called Apache, Oklahoma, in the southwest part of the state. And he said one morning he was walking down this little road. It looks like something from an old Western set. And he was walking down the road and he said, an old Comanche woman came up to me. She was a medicine woman. And she looked at him and she said, what happened to you, son? And he said, nothing. She said, no, no, no. I can tell from looking at you that something has changed. And for some reason, he didn't really want to go into it.
Mhm.
So he just said, no, nothing. And she said, no, no, no. I know something happened to you. What happened? And he told her the whole story that I just told you. And she said to him, you're good for something. And right now, you may not know what that is, but sometime very soon, you're going to find out what it is that you're good for. Now, he left from that and he started to think about what she had said. And he started to think back to what he remembered when he was a boy. Now, he was born, we don't even know what year he was born because they didn't really keep birth and death
Track.
records at that time. I met him when I was a very young man. I was like 21 years old when I met him, but he was born in the late 1800s.
Wow.
And he remembered being with the old medicine men when he was a boy and watching what they would do. Now, you figure if he was born in the 1890s, he was with these old timers that were born way before that. So
Yeah.
this is we're talking about going back in time here. And he described to me some of the things that he, by the way, this isn't just one session. This is, I'm telling you, from like years
Yeah.
of my time with him. But he talked about being with these elders and what they would do, these old men. And what they would do when they were with a group of people is that they would perform things that seemed impossible.
Mm.
And he would watch them. And in a group of people, basically what, I'm going to give you my
Yeah.
interpretation of this now, all these years later. But these men would perform things that would seem impossible as a way of, I think, cracking open the understanding of all the people that were there.
Mm.
Metaphorically, if this is possible, what's possible for me in my healing?
Mm.
And these old men would do things like they would bring a patient in. One man could, when somebody was hemorrhaging blood, he would stomp the ground with his foot and the bleeding would stop.
Wow.
Another man would rake out coals on the ground and he would walk over fire.
Mm.
And what Grandpa Chief realized was that he explained to me that you have to understand illness as being like a fire, and you've
Mhm.
got to fight fire with fire. So if you think about it, it was the flame that the visitor shot at him that healed him. And
Mhm.
somehow he came to this understanding that he needed to use fire in doctoring people. And that's why he would build a
Wow.
fire. He would take a coal out of the fire and put it in his mouth. And that would activate this healing potentiality that he had that he would then use in his doctoring of somebody who came to him who was sick.
Mm.
Now, we have
But
fulfilled.
he discovered that on his own journey, or was that someone who also, besides the visitor and the medicine woman, like gave him a hint, or was it then
Yeah,
something?
he
Yeah.
never explained that to me in a linear way that made sense. He
It's
just,
interesting. It's also a different part, no? To go
he
into
said,
how do they tell stories? Yeah,
I knew
never
what,
linear.
he
Yes.
said, I knew what to do.
Okay.
That's all he said. I knew what to do.
Okay. Wow.
So now, if we go back to that formula that I described to you before, we've got the prayer, the sacrifice, and the transformation.
Mhm.
Now we're at the point of giving back. So he became a medicine man. People started to hear the story about what had happened to him, and they started to show up at his house in order to be doctored. And, he developed his whole healing protocols, the things that he specialized in. The one part that I want to share with you, though, is near the end of his life, my last couple of encounters with him before he
Mhm.
passed away. Every time I would show up at his house, I would ask him about, oh, what happened since the last time I was here? Who came to you to be doctored? What did you do? What happened? Blah, 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 that sort of thing. So I showed up one day, and it was towards the end of the time that I was living there. And I said, oh, so, what happened? Done any doctoring since I was here? And he said, no. He said, I gave up doctoring. And I was shocked by that. And I said,
Okay.
what do you mean you gave up doctoring? And he said, yeah. He said, I'm getting old now. And it seems like every time I doctor somebody that I get weaker and weaker now.
Mm.
And it's taking too much out of me. So I gave it up. And then I didn't see him for a while and came back and, asked him what's new and everything. And it was maybe one of the last times that I saw him. He
Mhm.
told me the story that I'm going to tell you that I think brings this entire story together. He said, I was at my house one day and there was a knock at the door, and I went to the door and there was a man standing there. And the man said, are you Oliver Patapony? And he said, yeah. I said, yes, I am. And he said, I brought my wife here today because we don't know what to do. The doctors said they can't do anything else for her. The man was there in a station wagon with his wife and his children. And Grandpa Chief said to the man, he said, yeah, I hear what you're saying, but I'm sorry to have to tell you this, but I gave up doctoring. I really can't help you. And the man left. And about a week later, the man came back a second time. And this time, Grandma Esther was standing behind him. And the man was at the door. And he said, yeah, hi. I know that you said that you gave up doctoring, but I'm back because I don't know what else to do. I don't know anywhere else that I can turn to. And I'm so concerned about my wife. And Grandpa Chief was in the middle of explaining, yeah, it's kind of like I told you the last time I gave up doctoring. And Grandma Esther was standing behind him. And she said, you heard what that man said. You heard him say that he has nowhere else to go. And he said, so I doctored that man. I doctored that woman, rather. And he said, it took something out of me. And it wasn't that long after that he passed away. And I tell that story because it's a tough story. It's a tough pill to swallow.
Also from the
From a
perspective of his
from,
wife. I was
from a
thinking,
Western perspective, we would say, well, he should have taken care of himself. We might say, I can speculate. Maybe he wouldn't have died shortly thereafter if he had stopped doctoring. I don't know. I really don't know. But maybe that played a role in it. I don't know. But the point is, in his transformation was a culturally mediated dictate that he give back to other people. In other words, he had the crisis in his life. He did the prayer, he did the sacrifice, and for whatever reason, everything was right for his healing and his personal transformation. But that comes with a cost. And the cost is to give back. And I think that that story explains this mechanism of giving back better than any other story that I could possibly tell you. The importance of giving back to the wider community what was given to you.
So much for sharing. I haven't shared that in any of the other podcasts either. My shaman in Peru, I met her when my dad died, and she was a beautiful, gorgeous medicine woman. Her whole family is a medicine family. And when I last met her, I felt she was very depleted, and I also didn't feel like I was in the position to say anything. And short after, she died super suddenly. She was in the hospital, and then it was really like she was very young still. And I was very fortunate to be able to talk to her daughter at some point, and it was really interesting to see her two sons, her husband and her daughter, to deal with that, and how strong, how beautiful of medicine women and men they became in that journey. But also I said to her at some point, it was like, I never said that I saw this depletion, but I said that how she feels about that sacrifice. Like I understood this idea that we sometimes have of becoming a shaman or becoming a medicine woman, and you do this course of like maybe a month. I'm exaggerating right now. But this is a journey, that's a call. This comes with so much responsibility, and nobody is telling you that part. And I understood it when she died, because she had given so much, especially during pandemia, holding so many people, and so impressive with all her heart, with all her love, and bringing also her family with her on this journey, and then seeing that, and I was like, wow, this. And it was a moment I had that as well. I was like, it's not fair. Like, she has done so much. But then, yeah, now, like, you sharing that story with me, and it profoundly touched me, because I have so much respect from people who really decide, also through suffering, which you mentioned before, to take this call and go this journey with others, because it comes with something. And also in Guatemala, I saw one medicine man holding the fire for 11 hours. It was raining, and people escaped, put their umbrellas out, and he sat there for 11 hours. He kept this fire going, and I never have something. And that sacrifice, his wife was there, they do it together, and she was like with him there, and you could see him, and they left their children as well, and she talked with us very openly about it, like how this is, like when you have the call, and it's just two sides to it, and he's standing there, and for us, for the fire, for spirit, it was really, yeah.
And it's the opposite of, I think, the I don't know, the mainstream Western view is, oh, you become this spiritual master and you're on top of things, and you tell everybody else what to do, and you're elevated. Whereas in my experience, it's the opposite, that the real teachers, the real healers are the ones who are right there in the trenches. They're doing the hard work. They're suffering with the people sometimes that they are with, and they are the most humble, the last person in the world to tell you about how great they are. They're there in service in the best way that they know how.
Mm. Thank you. I want to finish with two questions. And the first one is we just talked about teachers, and one of your basically first teachers entering your life, and how he left this plane. Um, what have you become to learn about like following a teacher, being yourself a teacher on this journey over now half a century? No, but what is yeah, what also when you think about it, because you also mentioned that comparison out of a Western perspective, you know, we go, we have this teacher, and yeah, we go on, there's next teacher. What is a teacher for you?
So to me, a teacher is somebody who sets an example through his or her actions. And it's, just as likely to be a woman as a teacher as a man.
Yes,
Um,
both. Yeah, of course. Yeah.
so all the words in the world don't mean anything compared to the actions. So you watch the way that they are in the world. You observe the way that they are with another person. So if it's a healer, what is the presence that they bring to that encounter, to that
Mhm.
interaction? What is their way of holding space? What is their way of being with someone else? And then the words carry a different kind of meaning. That the words are often simple. That you can make things simple or you can make them complex. And when it comes to this notion of healing, it's easy to delve deeply into uh, information, but it's a completely different thing to live it. And I think honestly, I think of myself as kind of simple-minded in the sense that I have learned to watch and make things simple. And the people who have had the most impact on my life are the ones who maybe didn't use a lot of words, but each word carried so much weight and so much meaning that it didn't take a lot of words. It didn't take a lot of lectures. It just took a deeper understanding.
Mm. Mm. And if you, mm, no, other question. Hey, you just talked about simplicity. Before I go to the final question, but you talked about simplicity and how at some point, you also mentioned our Western linear way of thinking. You know, it's like tick, 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 tick. And when you come back to that, like when you encountered your teachers, you probably still have also teachers on your path. How much do you think is like storytelling part of that, or how much, besides being like simpler, maybe using few words, how much did your style of teaching also change on this
Oh
journey?
yeah. So my style of teaching changed in a lot of it is through stories.
Mhm.
A
You're
lot.
a storyteller, but you probably know that.
Well, thank you. A,
Amazing.
a lot of it is through stories because when I'm trying to make a point, I realize I can teach, and I've stood up in front of classrooms. I've taught anywhere from pre-kindergarten through college.
Mhm.
Lots of different teaching. I can stand up in front of a classroom. I could write stuff on a chalkboard and I can lecture all day long. But if I really want to make a point, I'll tell you a story. And depending on how I'm using the story, in some cases, I will elaborate what the story is, what the meaning is that I can take from it, and how I can use it in a particular context, or if I'm doing hypnotic storytelling where the story has a message for you that you need to find, then I won't tell you what the story means,
Mhm.
but I'll use stories.
Mhm.
And then because I deal with living in a Western society, I may often take something from that story and try to put that into a linear format so that somebody with a Western mind can understand. Now,
Mhm.
I want to tell you another very, very quick story
Of
about
course.
this, and it has to do with the writing of my book, Big Bo, The Spiritual Life and Teachings of a Kiowa Family. Towards the end of his life, my Uncle Richie, and if you read the book, there's a whole story about how he got to be my uncle. So I'm not going to tell you that story, but you'll read it. Uh, but that's an inspiring story as
I
well.
put the link below, guys, so that you know where you get it. Yes.
Um, Towards the end of his life, I showed up at Uncle Richie's house one day, and he said to me, Bob, you've been coming here for a long, long time. And over the course of my life, a number of people have come up to me and they've wanted to write my life story, the story of my great great grandfather, Big Bo, and all of the teachings and all of these things that I've done. And he said, and I turned them down. And he said, but I've watched the way that you came here with different people and you sat and you listened. And even my own family members didn't listen the way that you did. So I would like you to write this book for me. So of course I said yes.
Mhm.
It was an honor for him to say that. But then after I left, I was like, oh my goodness, what kind of a task did I take on here? What did I agree to? So for the next couple of years, he died a couple of years later, but for the next couple of years, every time I would go to his house, I would bring a tape recorder with me and I would record an interview with him. And every time I showed up, I would have a list of questions that I was going to ask him.
Mhm.
And every time he would respond, I would listen. And, in retrospect, I'm going to look back and say that through his storytelling, I sort of fell into a trance.
Mhm.
And it seemed like it answered the question. Sometimes I would ask him a question and he'd say, what are you asking me that for? You've been around here long enough to know the answer to that. And I'm like, I know, I want you to explain it so that I can put it in your words. So at any rate, I have all these recordings. They all seem to make sense at the time. And he died and the book wasn't done. So I had to figure out what to do with all of this. And I figured, oh, well, I'll just go back to the questions, look at the answers, and I'll format this book. So
Mhm.
I had all of the recordings transcribed, and the woman who transcribed them gave me back like hundreds of pages of interviews. I looked at the questions and I looked at the answers and I said, this doesn't tell anything. I ask him
Mhm.
a simple question. He goes around the world and comes back. I don't even remember what the question was by the time he's done talking. And I said, there is no way I can turn this into a book. I said, what am I going to do with this? But I had made a promise. So I'm going to tell you what I had to do to make sense out of it. I wrote in the margin what the topic was of every sentence fragment, every paragraph. And then I took manila folders and I wrote topics down and I took a pair of scissors and I cut the pieces out and put hundreds and hundreds of fragmentary ideas into each folder and then had to figure out how to make a chapter that would have a beginning and a middle and an end out of his words. And that's what I ended up doing with it. And metaphorically, that's what I do as a teacher. That story is the metaphor for the way that I teach, which is I've listened to stories my entire lifetime. I've listened to
Mhm.
narratives of these healers my entire lifetime. I've
Mhm.
built up a sense of meaning from within their culture while I maintain my position and my culture and try to somehow bring the two together. And so that's why that story
A
of
translator in
book,
some words.
yes,
Like, yeah,
exactly.
no, but also in a further sense. I don't know if you can say translator, but it's like it feels this, yeah, it's a bridge. It's a bridge.
Because
Yeah.
it's one thing to say the words. You could translate the words word by word, but it doesn't have meaning. So it's how to take all that experience and translate it into meaning that people can take with them, I hope. And I hope you have today in some small way.
Absolutely. I'm super grateful, and I also believe everyone listening is probably also very filled up, and I feel also you inspire to listen more, to to go this level deeper, where we maybe close our ears and eyes, and also getting away from judgment. We are so fast. I don't want to generalize, but I also know that about myself, and I'm like learning that. So yeah, deep-heartedly, to get out of this perspective of like, yeah, but this is my point of view. And it has been in that way a very big journey to live in Peruvian culture for over 4 years with a Peruvian man, and really like getting, like understanding what Germanness basically means. Like when we talk about culture in itself, or saying, oh, this is typical that, what do we actually know? From a journey of 2 weeks? Or is it the point when we also get into language, as you said, sitting there, listening to how humans tell stories? You don't even have to go so far back into indigenous societies or tribes. You can also stay in just going to China and stay in the States. It's like, what? Nothing can be, and then to ask questions. And so we are so often so fearful in asking questions. Why do you do that? Not like, why do you do that? Like, I saw you doing this. How interesting. And most
Well,
people cannot even answer this question. They don't know. They just do it
exactly.
habitually.
Well,
Yeah.
everything that you're saying about listening is, we didn't even get into that side of the journey because I had a parallel journey with Mesoamerican curanderismo.
Yeah, I know. This is
We
our
didn't even get
second.
into, we didn't even touch on that, but
That's our second interview, guys. We
another
are going to,
interview.
yes, I
But
feel the same. Yes.
I do want to make one point
Yes,
that comes
please.
out. What I learned in curanderismo is one part of it is something called plática. Plática is the heart-to-heart talk that begins all healing sessions in
Mm,
curanderismo as I learned it.
mhm.
One of my teachers was Elena Avila, who wrote an excellent book that I highly recommend to you called Woman Who Glows in the Dark. And she was the best teacher that I ever had in Plática. And this is that sacred listening. And
Mm,
it's all about what this field that is coming. I mean, I don't know if you guys have it popularized in Germany, but we call it narrative medicine here in the United States. And narrative medicine is my ability to listen in a sacred way to your story and very often connect it with another story. So within your story may be the limitations, the healing, and the suffering. From the other story, there is healing, and to bring these, mesh these two together as a part of your healing process. And I like to describe it as healing shrapnel. So
mhm.
when you witness a healing event, there is the healing of the person who is being healed in the ceremony, but everybody who is watching is healed through the shrapnel, the pieces of that healing
Yeah.
power that was released. And in the same way, the healing story has an impact on the listener. So the healer is the ultimate listener in having absorbed other stories, hearing the story of the suffering of the patient, and then being able to select the right story that goes along with creating a new narrative, which is you as the healed person.
Hmm. Interesting. What came into my mind is often also the part why it's so hard to listen. And besides our triggers, also as a, if we feel like we have to do certain things, or the fear we have of the pain of the other. And I was often thought or came about that this is empathy, but actually this has not so much to do with empathy in that moment. Empathy is something, again, the observer, the listener. It's more a part of like, oh God, I have to take the suffering away, something has to happen. And I'm coming also from acting, and one of my teachers said once, and I really love that, it's like, hell, let that person cry if they cry.
Mm-hmm.
Stop, like, if you guys feel the urge to step up, to just take the pain in that moment away, you do it for yourself. If you at least are capable in asking, hey, what do you need right now? Can I give you a hug? Then you are starting to bring the attention to that person, what they need.
Perfect. That's exactly right. And if I had to describe, one of the things that is the hardest thing to teach is that, in my working with my apprentices, we will sometimes, I'll go over a session with them that they had with somebody else, and they'll very often have this tendency to want to rush through it to get that person, come on, heal right now. And what that person needs more than anything is to be heard, to be held in that sacred moment of listening.
Oh, Bob. This is so, I could talk forever, forever, forever with you. I want to finish, and I think then in our second time, for everyone who already heard that, we will be on at some point for second interview on his second part of the whole history. But about the work you do. So if someone wants to get in contact with you and wants to know like what you are offering, like, yeah, what is your how do you say, what's your medicine?
Well, come to my website, www.bobvetter.com. So
You
BOBVETTER.com.
see it below as
Are
well.
There are all kinds of free resources that are there. I have plenty of podcast episodes that are up. There are some blogs. There's the game Sustos that I mentioned before, as well as workshops, travel programs that I do to sacred places. And you can just email me. So go there. That's the link to everything.
Perfect. I will link it below for every one of you. And yeah, and I can just say thank you so much also for being so open to bring your heart, and also sharing this very, very beautiful, touching story where so many wisdom nuggets were also in. And yeah, I'm very looking forward to have a second interview with you. Thank you
It's
so
a
much.
pleasure speaking with you, Kim. And I
Mm,
appreciate so much the questions that you brought to me today.
thank you.
And listeners out there, I hope that there is something contained in these words that will make a difference to you in your life so that you can make a difference to the people around you.
Thank you. Bob already said that. Yes, absolutely. And also, please share with us what maybe was something you took out of this, or where you were like, wow, I haven't, maybe something mind blowing for you, or something that deeply touched you. We are very curious about your experience with us too here in this interview. Thank you. I'm very thankful that you have joined today's episode. And if you want to know more about me, you can find me on Instagram at das Herz einer Frau, the heart of a woman, and also die Kakaohüterin, los guardianes del cacao, the guardians of cacao. Have a beautiful, beautiful day, and I see you next time.